Power meters are a great tool, enabling you to train more accurately and more precisely, and they can lead to huge performance gains for all levels of cyclists. But fitting your power meter to your bike is just the first step of the process. So coming up are 5 things you should do with your power meter. Power meters come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and can be fitted in many different locations on your bike. You've got power pedals, power meters in the crank arms, which can be left-sided or dual-sided, or even based into the spider system of the chain rings at the front. You can even get power meters that fit into the rear hub of your bike. But even with all these different types, they ultimately all give out the reading, and that's the force that the rider's putting through the pedals. First up, you're going to want to perform a zero offset or calibrate function on your power meter if it has that ability to do that. And you're going to want to do that before every ride. Manufacturers will have a set process that you need to follow to calibrate it correctly. But ultimately, you're performing a set action to allow the unit to know that no force is being applied to it and give it a bit of a baseline reading to be as accurate as possible. And talking about accuracy, one of the things that can affect the accuracy of a power meter is the altitude and temperature that you're riding in. Now, the altitude is not going to dramatically change too quick unless you somehow can get all the way to the top of a mountain in the click of a button, but the temperature can change quite quickly, especially if you've got your bike stored indoors and you calibrated it and then moved off out into the cold conditions. So it's worth putting your bike outside and just giving it 10 minutes to change the conditions that you're going to be riding in. Using the zero offset function on your power meter is very much the same as using the tar or zero function on your kitchen scales at home. You're giving the device a baseline reading so that it knows that any additional force comes from you. Power meters are a precision measuring tool, but they're only accurate if you remember to calibrate them. So it's important to get into that habit before every ride. Most power meters typically have an accuracy range of plus or minus a couple of percent. And if you're a bit unsure that your power meter is accurate or not, many turbo trainers also have a power meter built into them, so you could compare the two and see how they measure up. Like any tool or equipment, you need to know how to use it correctly, and this applies for your power meter and your own body too. So one of the first things you're going to want to do is to perform a fitness test to assess your physical performance. And one of the first things to test is your FTP, or functional threshold power, and this is the greatest power you can sustain for 1 hour. And 2 methods of assessing this are to perform the 20-minute test or the dreaded ramp test. And although these are pretty gruesome, they're quite satisfying once you've completed them. Another good metric to monitor is your maximum power. And this is just a great stat to measure and even compare against your friends. But funnily enough, it's just not a stat that I hear Ollie shouting about very much. A little bit suspicious if you ask me. These tests can be performed indoors or outdoors, and if you go outdoors, it's important to use the same roads so you can compare your test results against each other. But if you are heading outdoors, avoid those busy roads, especially with lots of junctions and traffic lights, because these can negatively affect the test results. Indoors is best as it's a far more controlled environment that you can replicate time and time again. If you're going to do some testing, it's important to test regularly to help monitor your progress and make sure you're getting the best out of yourselves and your training sessions. So I'd recommend maybe doing some testing every month or so just to keep on track. Although that said, it is pretty horrible, but once it's out of the way, it's quite a good feeling to get done. So you've done your fitness testing, but what's up next? Well, that fitness test is going to enable you to set your training zones to use as a gauge of how hard you're riding, enable you to get the most from your structured training. Training zones are here to help you gauge your effort. Don't think of your effort as just an on or off switch, think of it as a tap, and these training zones are here to help you control and monitor that effort nice and precisely. Whilst you're at this point, it's also a great idea to set and monitor some goals, because you need to think about what you want to try and achieve. Is it a certain effort or just a general improvement? So using a power meter will really help you get the best from your training. On the subject of training zones, it's also helpful to set up your head unit to display this information. I quite often like to have 3 or 5 second average power on display instead of instantaneous power, because the numbers just jump around a lot and it can be quite confusing. I also quite like to have the actual training zone that you're riding in, and that can be programmed into the head unit itself or using the corresponding app. One final feature that I always have on display is to have my last lap average power. And this is particularly helpful if you're doing short, hard efforts where you haven't got time to concentrate on what the power meter's reading and you can look at it afterwards. All this information is great, but it's not much use if you don't know what to do with it, and you could end up with information overload where there's just so much stuff, it all looks very confusing. But luckily enough, there are systems and programs like Training Peaks enabling you to pick out the super clear information that you want to look at and that's most important to you, meaning your training is going to be more precise and accurate than ever before. Power meters collect a lot of data, and it's far more than you would ever realise. If your head unit is connected to your power meter via Bluetooth, it communicates a whopping 64 times every second. So make sure you don't back off from those super tough training efforts, because trust me, your power meter is going to pick up even the slightest of changes. But with all this data, it is worth taking the time to just sit down, read through it all, and give yourself a chance to try and learn how to understand it. Some of the most useful bits of data you can pick out and analyse is your left to right power balance, your average power from your ride or efforts, the normalised power, and at any given point throughout your ride you can look at all of the individual power and efforts that you've done throughout, giving you precise control over what you've done. Pacing and effort is an area many beginners will struggle with, setting off far too hard and dying a million deaths towards the end of their efforts. And this is where power meters can come in handy. If, for example, you've got a time trial coming up and it was going to be about 20 minutes long, you can look back at your previous best efforts and you know what sort of power you can look to hold and sustain. During a race, it can be so easy to get carried away at the start and ride far too hard than what you can sustain. So pacing your effort can sometimes lead to dramatic increases in speed during your event. Oh, and one final thing, don't be a power bore like Ollie. There's only so much power and number talk I can take in one day. Sure, your new FTP is cool, but I'm not that fussed, to be honest. Sorry, mate. So we know how we can use power meters, but what about the pros? How do they use power meters? Well, pro cyclists and their coaches will use power meters to monitor every single aspect of their riding and training to make sure they're getting the very best from everything they do. Well, let's face it, the difference between winning and losing at some of the world's biggest races is so slim, every single watt matters. I mean, I'm not a pro anymore, but when I switched across to using a power meter, I found it helped me dramatically, and so many of my efforts were so more precise and dialed in, I could get the very best from all of my training. So there you have it, 5 things you should do with a power meter. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you have, give it a big thumbs up. If you've got any useful tips of your own, get them in the comments section down below. Thanks very much, see you later.